Good morning, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the 2021 Kentucky Tobacco Control Conference. Thank you so much for spending your morning with us for our second webinar, Local Elected Officials and Smoke-Free Policy. My name is Ellen Cartmell, and I am the Program Manager for the Tobacco Prevention and Cessation Program at the Kentucky Department for Public Health. We have a great lineup of speakers for you today. So I'm just going to share a few announcements before we dive in, and then we can get started. First, everyone is on mute, as you may have noticed, but you can still be involved in the discussion, and we hope that you will be. All you need to do is go to the questions box, and you can enter questions, comments, things you'd like us to address in the question and answer section, anything like that right there. And also remember to check the separate chat box for announcements as we go forward. So this webinar series would not be possible without our amazing sponsors. And those are UK Healthcare, Kentucky Health Collaborative, the Kentucky Asthma Management Program, and Interact for Health. So please join me in thanking them for their support. Next, we want this conversation to be as interactive as possible, so please do join the discussion. You can tweet at us using hashtag KYTobaccoFree, or you can message tag the Kentucky Tobacco Prevention and Cessation Program at KYTobaccoFree, and the Kentucky Center for Smoke-Free Policy at KYSmokeFree. So you can tweet at the speakers, talk about things that you're learning, and just let everyone know your thoughts on what we're learning today. As the webinar begins to wrap up, we hope that you will stay on the line and fill out a short survey. And if you do that, you will be entered to win a free $25 Amazon gift card. And 8 people will win one of those. So you have really good odds if you just fill out that evaluation form. And we will share the link on the screen and also in the chat box toward the end of the presentation. That is my final announcement, which means that it's time to get started. So today we're going to hear the perspectives and experiences of experts in local policymaking related specifically to smoke-free public policy. 36.6% of Kentuckians are currently protected by local smoke-free laws that cover all indoor public places and indoor workplaces. So there are now 55 communities that have a smoke-free ordinance, and 36 of those also include e-cigarettes, including the 2 communities that we're going to hear from today. The communities you see listed on this map are the ones with comprehensive smoke-free ordinances, which means they cover all workplaces and public places equally. Research has shown that Kentucky communities with comprehensive smoke-free laws have reduced hospitalizations for COPD, heart attacks, and asthma. They have fewer new cases of lung cancer and fewer youth who start to smoke compared to communities with a partial law or no law. So we're going to hear more about the process of passing one of these policies from 3 experts today. We will hear from Kentucky League of Cities CEO J.D. Chaney, Oldham County Health Educator Liz Burrows, and Campbellsville City Councilman Dave Nunery. Our first presenter will be J.D. J.D. began his career with the Kentucky League of Cities as a law clerk before serving as the Kentucky League of Cities Council for Member Legal Services, and later as Director of Governmental Affairs, Chief Governmental Affairs Officer, and Deputy Executive Director. J.D. has spent years advocating for Kentucky cities with the General Assembly in Frankfort, although he continues to draft and lobby legislation to help benefit city governments throughout the Commonwealth of Kentucky. J.D., thank you for joining, and go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation, Ellen, to participate in this conference. Of course, spent 20 years with the League of Cities, but I started out, I like to share one of my first assignments after passing the Kentucky bar exam was to write an amicus brief for the Kentucky Supreme Court on a challenge to Lexington's smoking ban, which I want to talk about the question about local authority to be able to regulate indoor smoking through through the enactment of ordinances. A lot of people will say, well, show me the statute, show me in law in black and white, where it says in the volumes of the Kentucky Revised Statutes, which you can see behind me, where it says that a city government has the ability to do this. And you're not, or a county government, you're not going to find it in all those pages, a statute that grants authority specifically to local governments to be able to regulate in this area. It was a hard-fought court win in the Kentucky Supreme Court, interpreting what we call home rule, or the ability for local governments to regulate or enact public policies to further the public purpose in their communities without specific authorization. And Kentucky cities and counties do have home rule authority to do that. It's if you're not prohibited from doing it, you're authorized to do it under Kentucky law, unless there is either express preemption or there is implied preemption. And it took a 2003 court decision by the Kentucky Supreme Court to interpret that home rule statute, which we were involved in terms of what home rule meant. And that was really the impetus for the league's involvement in that court case, was to say we are not preempted from doing it. Now, the Restaurant Association in Lexington and Beverage Association argued that sanitary laws, other laws preempted us from doing that, that were on the books that created some implied preemption. But the court looked to old decisions, and one of the quotes that they had out of that case, citing an old case related to use of sewers, was that the protection of public health is not only an obligation of city governments, but it's a manifest duty of cities. It's one of the reasons that they exist. And if you haven't read that case, I'd be happy to share it with you. But it makes crystal clear that local governments, cities and counties both, do have the ability to protect the public health and enact ordinances to advance that cause, and that we do have concurrent authority with the state to regulate in that area. So it is a well-established principle that cities and county governments have the ability to do that based on that Supreme Court ruling, which is a perennial case for home rule authority, also for city and county governments to regulate in other areas where the state has not preempted us. Second thing I want to address is the process for going about doing that, and how do you do local legislation. For city and county governments, it's not statutes or necessarily regulations. City and county governments enact local legislation through the promulgation and enactment of ordinances. And for ordinances to be properly adopted, they have to have certain form, as outlined in state law. They have to have force and effect once they're adopted. If they're properly adopted, they have the same force and effect of state law if the procedures are followed and it's not otherwise a preempted or illegal action. So ordinances in Kentucky for city and county governments both are required to be in writing. They're required to only relate to one subject, much like state law. They have to have an ordaining clause. All of them have to say, be it ordained by the city council of Campbellsville. I'll use that example since we have a council member from Campbellsville. So it has to say, be it ordained in there in order for it to be legal. And there's a strict compliance standard that the ordinances follow that required legal form in order to be enacted. They have to be read into the record, 2 meetings on 2 separate days. So there's 2 reading requirements, unlike state legislation where you have 3 reading requirements on separate days. There are 2 reading requirements. They can be read in full or they can be read in summary. Either one. If it's read in summary, the summary has to be prepared by an attorney licensed to practice law in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Some cities vote after the first reading. It's not a legal requirement for cities and counties to take votes in between after the first reading. It may just be read and no vote. That's a typical process. But you may find in some city governments or county governments that they'll vote after the first reading to go on to the second reading, even though it's not a legal requirement to do so. Depending on the type of government that you're in, when it comes to cities, you may have to have a mayor sign, much like the governor does or the president sign laws enacted by Congress. If you're in a mayor council form of government, then the mayor has to either sign the ordinance or let it become law without his or her signature, or may veto the ordinance. So that's an additional hurdle, and the vast majority of Kentucky cities are organized with a strong mayor that has that separate executive authority. If you're in some other cities, you may be organized under a commission form of government or a city manager form of government. In those cities, the mayor doesn't have that separate veto authority. So in mayor council cities, when you look at that form of government, in addition to the legislative body, you're going to want to have the mayoral support as well, because the mayor will either have to sign or veto it. You can enact an ordinance without the mayor's support. It's a legislative act. The council is in that form of government can always override a mayoral veto by one more than a majority of the entire membership in order to override a veto. And then once the process is done, in order for the ordinance to have legal binding effect, it has to be published. And there are different rules for publication. Sometimes it has to be in 9 counties, it has to be published on a website. In the other Kentucky counties, it has to be published in a newspaper of general circulation in the area in order for the ordinance to have final effect and enforceability. I also want to point out for those advocates who are looking at getting a city or county government to adopt an ordinance, to use the resources that are available to you. There are models available at the League of Cities. There are models available through the center that could be utilized by city attorneys, council members, commissioners who are interested in sponsoring this, to be able to use as a template. And they're good model ordinances. We know those models will survive a challenge of arbitrariness. Ellen touched on the point that you have some cities and counties with more comprehensive ordinances, and not speaking at that from a policy perspective, but we know those will survive a challenge of arbitrariness. You know, if you treat some businesses different than other businesses, that could open you up to a challenge that hadn't been fully litigated in Kentucky at this point. So you know you've got models there that will help you survive a constitutional challenge, and I think it's important that you access those resources. In addition, I'll go back. I think Ellen may have posted or may be posting a summary and citations of the cases that really show the legal authority for cities to be able to regulate in this area and county governments to regulate in this area. And you may want to use that as a reference if you are challenged about the legality of a city or county doing so. The third point I want to touch on is the difference between city and county government. You may decide that you're going to work with the city, or you may decide you want to work with a county government, and they are two very different entities. Whereas county governments are primarily designed to deliver statewide services at the local level, city governments have typically been more involved in code enforcement, public health, rather than solely focused on the delivery of statewide services at the local level. But we get a lot of questions about how city and county governments interact, and under Kentucky law, if a county government enacts an ordinance, that ordinance applies countywide, even within the corporate jurisdictions of the cities that are contained within the county. So if a county government does so, a county government adopt a smoke-free ordinance, it would apply even in all the cities located within the county, unless, and every law seems to have an exception, unless the city enacts an ordinance on the same subject matter and imposes the same or more stringent standards in that ordinance. So if you're, for example, if you're looking at a county, let's just say Muhlenberg County, if Muhlenberg County enacted a smoke-free ordinance prohibiting indoor smoking in any businesses, any workplaces, then that would apply inside the city limits of Central City, inside the city limits of Greenville, just the same, unless one of those cities enacted a smoke-free ordinance on its own, same subject matter, and imposed even more stringent standards. Typically, I think what most advocates have seen is that cities, just because they've typically occupied the realm of regulating public health in a number of ways more than county governments have, is that city governments typically tend to be where more restaurants are located, more business occurs, have been more readily acceptable of adopting policies like this that touch upon public health matters. And then the last thing before I yield to additional speakers, and happy to answer any questions as we go along, is how to engage your local officials in the policy making process. And we really do embrace this concept of home rule at my organization. We want to create model ordinances. Local decisions are best left made to local officials. But as you approach your local officials, and Dave, I know will touch on this, is they're persuaded by data, and the fact that you have years and years of data now, and that was important when Lexington first took the step out, is the information and data about the impact of tobacco use on public health and secondhand smoke exposure. It is replete, and it's irrefutable. That information helps drive local policy decisions, and providing that information and those statistics really help your local officials drive their policy decisions. And of course, politics always plays a role in any of this lawmaking process or local legislation. And the benefit of Lexington having gone now 18 years ago or better with its smoke-free ordinance, I don't know how many years exactly, at least 18 years ago that the Supreme Court upheld it, is that you can look at the political consequences of the way the voters responded. If you talk to your local officials, we have a lot of evidence that there's not any political repercussions from taking this vote at any of these local governments that have taken it. So if you need to look at that history and use those facts, you're able to point to that in terms of helping local politics. I think by and large you'll find that most local elected officials, whether it's city or county, especially city government, the people that I represent, are not doing it for power or pay. They're doing it to make their community better. They're real public servants. The pay is not impressive. The power is not intoxicating with the 3 a.m. phone calls about barking dogs or loud neighbors. It's the people that serve in these roles are doing it to make their community better. And I think you'll find a lot of local officials who are open to these discussions about how to improve their communities and protect the health, which again, I'll go back and say is a manifest duty of Kentucky city governments. Ellen, with that, I'll yield to the rest of the panel.
Thank you so much. And we are going to take questions at the end after all three presenters. However, we did receive one that I think would be good to go ahead and address. JD, if you could help me with this one. Somebody said, does home rule include include regulating sales and advertising of tobacco products. So this is the preemption question. If you could just briefly get us all on the same page with that before we continue.
That's a great question, and it is because we are preempted in that area. Kentucky statute does prohibit local governments from enacting any ordinances that address the regulation related to sale, display, advertisement of tobacco products. We're not preempted. There's not a statute that addresses this indoor smoking area, and there are advocates that are pushing pretty strongly with the legislature to repeal the preemption statute that was enacted. It's almost in terms of sale, advertisement, age limits, things of that nature. There's almost a tobacco supremacy. The way home rule works is that we're authorized to act. Local governments are authorized to act in any area where we haven't either been expressly preempted or impliedly preempted. And when it comes to sale and advertisement, we are expressly preempted. The legislature enshrined that in statutes that no local government can enact an ordinance. Implied preemption is more litigious in that you have a comprehensive scheme of legislation that wouldn't leave any room for local control. And that's what the Restaurant Association in Lexington argued in 2003, even though there wasn't a statute that said local governments can't do it. They said because of the extensive nature of health safety codes in the state statutes and other statutes, that we were impliedly preempted from doing so. And that's a much heavier burden. So home rule authorizes us to act unless there's some contrary law or some comprehensive scheme of legislation. And unfortunately, on the other one, we are preempted expressly. One of about 30 statutes that touch upon local government's inability to act.
Well, thank you so much for clarifying that. We will go ahead and move on. So thank you so much, JD, for giving us that overview and sharing your expertise. Next, we will hear from Liz Burrows, who is a health educator with the Oldham County Health Department. Liz has been working in the field of substance abuse prevention for 22 years and has been the tobacco control coordinator for the Oldham County Health Department for over 10 years. She completed the Breathe Tobacco Treatment Specialist Training Program in January of last year and is a proud recipient of the Smoke-Free Hero Award. Liz is passionate about tobacco prevention and cessation and has been one of the lead proponents of the Oldham County Smoke-Free Ordinance initiatives in 2006 and 2018, which we'll hear about in just a minute. In addition to serving as the tobacco control coordinator for the Oldham County Health Department, she also serves as the program director for the Coalition for a Healthy Oldham County's Drug-Free Communities Support Program grant. So take it away, Liz.
Thank you so much. I am happy to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if I can. Okay, I am always happy to talk about Oldham County's journey to a smoke-free environment. I like to say that in Oldham County, we just had so much fun doing it, and we found it so easy that we did it twice. Here's a brief timeline of what our journey looked like. And as you can see, it was not an overnight event. It was definitely a process. In 2003, we founded the Oldham County Tobacco Awareness Coalition, and that was, while a goal of that coalition, kind of a longer term goal, was policy change. We really started working on education, awareness, prevention, and cessation, and kind of laying the groundwork of eventually working on policy change. By 2005, we were ready to have a subcommittee kind of branch out and really start intentionally working on policy change. In 2006, we were very excited because our first comprehensive ordinance passed. It passed in December, and it was completely comprehensive. Unfortunately, our excitement was short-lived because in 2007, fiscal court, our local county, passed an amendment that significantly weakened our comprehensive ordinance. So for 10 years, from 2007 to 2017, Oldham County was served by a partial ordinance. And while not optimal, in 2017, we decided it had been 10 years and we would celebrate 10 years since the ordinance passed. And we would talk about how the enforcement was minimal. It had become a community norm to have smoke-free locations. Many of the places who had taken advantage of the amendment, the weakening, which mostly included smoking break rooms, many of those businesses had kind of eliminated those break rooms in the course of that 10 years. And since it had been 10 years and we wanted to celebrate that, we also started looking towards strengthening it. And we knew when we wanted to strengthen it that we would add electronic cigarettes because those had not been prevalent when we passed the initial ordinance. And in addition, we would try to get rid of the exemptions that were added in 2007. So we started kind of laying the groundwork again in 2017. In 2018, we passed our second comprehensive ordinance. And we were again very excited. It was a similar process. And again, pretty quickly after the comprehensive ordinance passed, we had some amendments recommended by a local vape shop owner and the owner of a cigar bar. And so for a couple of months, we worked with fiscal court and actually LaGrange City Council on those proposed amendments. In the end, I am very happy to say that the amendments were not adopted and our policy remains comprehensive. Some of the things that we did to engage local policymakers was start very early. As early as 2003, when our Tobacco Awareness Coalition began, again, we started laying that groundwork of education in the community as well as with our policymakers. So we got to know them. We got to know our city council. We got to know our fiscal court members. We wanted them to know us as well. So we approached them and asked them if we could include them on our email lists. And we would send out, anytime we did something related to tobacco prevention, cessation, or awareness, they would receive that so that they kind of had a foundation for what we were doing in the community and why it was important. We laid in between 3 and 6, we worked on focusing on secondhand smoke and the dangers of that. And then when we revisited it, we were laying the foundation within the community and policymakers on secondhand aerosol and why the dangers that brought. So we wanted to make sure we knew them and they knew us. We also needed to educate ourselves on the process to pass an ordinance. So we went to fiscal court meetings. We learned about the first reading and the second reading. We learned that if there were significant changes between the first reading and the second reading, then we would go back into the process and do another first reading. So we really wanted to make sure that we were educated on the process. At that time too, we did some policymaker assessments, and I think there's still some really good tools on policymaker assessments through Breathe, Kentucky Center for Smoke-Free Policy. Some of our assessments were done informally. Some of them were done more formally, kind of a one-on-one meeting. And through those assessments, that's how we identified our champions. And we were very fortunate in the first initiative to pass an ordinance that we had 3 pretty strong fiscal court magistrates that were champions. And they really helped us understand the process even more. They invited us to come and speak at fiscal court, which opened the door to start working on an ordinance. The information that we found that was helpful to provide our policymakers was, again, like JD said, we have hard data. We have decades of data on the dangers of secondhand smoke. We now have lots of data on the dangers of secondhand aerosol. So we definitely shared that information with them and with the community. We were also fortunate enough to be able to conduct an air quality study in Oldham County. And that was really important because it showed our elected officials that not only is this a general problem, it is a problem right here in Oldham County. It's very specifically, we have workers and residents and visitors who are exposed to secondhand smoke that is in the pollution category in Oldham County. So that was a really important tool for us to have. We also did a telephone survey. So in addition to the facts and evidence on the dangers of secondhand smoke, we wanted to show the elected officials that there was support in the community for a comprehensive ordinance. So we were able to share with our policymakers that the overwhelming majority of Oldham County residents believed that secondhand smoke was a moderate to serious health hazard, and the majority also supported a comprehensive ordinance. So we really did want to provide a lot of data to them, but we also wanted to provide some community member stories. We didn't want it to just be data. So when we would come to present at fiscal court, we would present the data, but we would also have some community advocates that would talk about their stories and why it's important to them that we pass a comprehensive ordinance. Some of the specific messaging, we always brought it back to public health. This was a public health issue. We talked about exposure to secondhand tobacco smoke during the first round, and then in 2017, we were highlighting the effects of secondhand aerosol. We talked mostly about how it impacted workers in the businesses, and we also talked about families. We had some youth come and talk about why it was important to them to pass comprehensive smoke-free ordinance, but we didn't want to focus specifically on youth because we had some magistrates suggest that maybe if it was an issue for families and youth, that we just limit the number of hours that businesses could allow smoking, or limit the age. Like if a business only served people 18 and over, they could allow smoking, but other businesses could not. So while we included some of those conversations, we really focused on the health of workers in the community. Again, we wanted to specifically message about the community support. So we had a compilation of grassroots advocates that would reach out and talk to their magistrates specifically. And we conducted a postcard campaign, and we really did start early, kind of laying the groundwork to work on policy. Every time we went to a health fair, or even if we had our clinic doing flu shots, we had some postcards made, and we would ask participants if they would be willing to sign a postcard in support of a comprehensive ordinance. And when we went to present to fiscal court, we were able to share, I think, between 350 to 500 individual postcards from constituents that supported a comprehensive ordinance. We had business owners testify. Really, most of them didn't speak out in person at public comment meetings. Many of our business owners that supported it spoke to their magistrates independently, and the feedback we got was they were in support of the ordinance, and they wanted the fiscal court to pass an ordinance because they didn't want to anger some of their customers by doing it voluntarily. So we did have some business support. And we also tried to specifically message some reassurances, because we knew, based on the policymaker assessment, as well as kind of concerns that had come up in communities previously, what the opposition might be, what the concerns of the magistrates were. So we talked about enforcement. We sent messages about enforcement either in emails or in personal conversations, that communities that had passed comprehensive ordinances had not had a problem with enforcement. And we also wanted them to know that they wouldn't be responsible for solely enforcing the ordinance, that the health department, code enforcement would all take a role in that. Thank you, Lexington, because we did also send some messages on the legality and being able to quote that it was a manifest duty, and that was a role of fiscal court, and a very important one, was incredibly important in showing them that this had been litigated, this was approved, this had been decided, that this was an appropriate policy that could be passed and withstood a legal challenge. We did use the Lexington ordinance as our model ordinance, and we were fortunate enough that for our initial ordinance, that our 3 champions were willing to use that ordinance and base our ordinance off of that. The second time we started working, when we started to add e-cigs and remove the exemptions that had been passed, we had some conversations about puzzle pieces because when we were talking about electronic cigarettes and how dangerous they were, we had a couple magistrates who really wanted to focus on education. They really thought it was important to educate the community about the dangers of secondhand aerosol and just the dangers of e-cig use. And we agreed with that completely. We believe that education is very important. So we talked about how the health department and the coalition do a lot of education. That is one of our primary focuses, and how fiscal court and how city leadership, their puzzle piece is this policy, is passing a policy that can protect everyone who lives, works, and plays in Oldham County. And that is a very important piece of protecting health, is being able to pass that policy. The ways that we reached out to our elected official, we had letters to the editor written. A lot of our grassroots advocates would write letters to the editor. We knew that they were reading the Oldham Era. Phone calls from constituents, phone calls from ourselves. We participated in public comment at the fiscal court meetings. And again, we were very fortunate in that our 3 champions that first time around, and then 2 of our champions the second time around, were very willing to let us have a seat at the table when they were working on the ordinance. So we got to sit in on the Public Safety Committee, and then with the first 3 magistrates in 2006, and be part of that process. And they were really receptive to using the Lexington ordinance as a guide because it had been approved. So we participated in committee meetings. We sent emails. We did not have back then social media, which I think was probably a blessing. So we didn't like or follow, but we did send emails. We sent postcards, and we utilized the fact sheets and the info sheets from our partners, from Kentucky's Center for Smoke-Free Policy, from Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids. A lot of the fact sheets that they have available address the concerns of our magistrates. So we definitely use those fact sheets to share information. What we learned that the messenger really does matter. One thing that we found that our magistrates really appreciated was hearing the health message from local physicians. So we had a couple local physicians who were kind of prominent in the community, who were very respected. They had a lot of credibility, and they kind of gave a lot of the message on the health effects of secondhand smoke and secondhand aerosol. We learned that the messenger can be we also chose the wrong messenger on occasion. We invited Dr. Troutman in our initial push. He was the director of Louisville Public Health and Wellness at the time. Absolutely phenomenal, very, very knowledgeable, very gracious to come and speak to our fiscal court about Jefferson County's journey with their smoke-free ordinance. And we learned that that did not go well. So our fiscal court, some of the members just did not want to hear from a leader from a county that they saw as so different than Oldham. So we did learn that the messenger matters. We also learned that the unexpected can happen. We had lots of conversations with our magistrates leading up to each vote. And we thought going into the first round in 2006 that we knew we had 5 magistrates that were going to support the ordinance on the second reading, so it would pass. And we had 3 magistrates that were no's, and the county judge at the time did not support the ordinance, so she was a no. So going into the second reading, we were pretty confident that we had 5 yeses and 4 no's. Well, when public comment happened and then the magistrates began to vote, and our 5th magistrate actually voted no. So at that moment, we all kind of sat back. We all, in our heads, were thinking, well, we'll come back next year. We can do this again. We gave it a best shot. And then when the county judge, because at that point it was a tie, it was 4 magistrates were yes, 4 were no. When the county judge cast her vote, and again, she had been no for a very long time, she spoke for a while on why she had been no, and then she ended with, however, I can't in good conscience leave my post. She was not reelected for the next term. and know and go into restaurants and businesses in Oldham County and see workers and families exposed to secondhand smoke and know I could have done something about it and I didn't. And so she actually voted yes, and that's how the comprehensive ordinance passed in 2006. So the unexpected can definitely happen. We learned that a balance of data and stories was important, and being able to anticipate and counter the concerns was very important. So again, we knew kind of going in Oldham County based on community assessments or based on policymaker assessments that many of the magistrates were concerned with business rights. They really saw this in a business rights kind of way, and so we tried to frame it in the public health messaging, which it is a public health issue, and to be able to kind of address those concerns about business rights. And again, it was very helpful to have the fact sheets. It was very helpful to have the studies on communities that had gone before that had not seen businesses go under or an impact on businesses. And many of them had seen positive impacts on business. So being able to share that information was very important. We found out that follow-up is vital because in the initial passage of the ordinance in 2006, we did not, after the ordinance passed, we did not attend any additional fiscal court meetings. And what we learned is that between the time the ordinance passed and we heard about it in the paper, at one of the fiscal court meetings, they had scheduled an emergency meeting. They had proposed this new amendment. They had had a first reading on this amendment, and we weren't aware because we weren't there. So we did learn second time around to make sure we were still in conversations with our champions even after the ordinance passed, and that we continued to go to follow-up fiscal court meetings just to make sure we were still in good shape. We also, and I still am so grateful to the champions we had in fiscal court in 2006. They were invaluable in walking us through the process and being supportive, and they were very brave in supporting it when some of their colleagues were not supportive. They were incredibly gracious in letting us be part of the process. So we wanted to thank them, and we thank them on a regular basis. We also thanked them when it passed publicly in the newspaper. So we thanked our volunteers and our grassroots advocates, but we also wanted to thank our policymakers.
Liz, I'm going to go ahead and move us on to Dave, but we can come back during the question and answer session if you have some remaining thoughts. This has been excellent.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So as I said, that was really enlightening, and I learned a lot from my own community. So we have one more speaker that I want to make sure that we get to, and that is Campbellsville City Council member Dave Nunery. Dave is a retired lawyer from Campbellsville, where he practiced with Nunery and Call Attorneys at Law, a practice he started in 1993. He previously practiced with McBrayer, McGinnis, Leslie, and Kirkland in Lexington. Dave retired in 2006, but remains of counsel with the firm. As a longtime Campbellsville City Council member, Dave was the legislative champion for Campbellsville's comprehensive smoke-free workplace ordinance, which was enacted nearly 10 years ago, over 10 years ago in June 2009. And he was also the champion when Campbellsville successfully amended their ordinance to add e-cigarettes in 2019. So he continues to serve today as a city council member in Campbellsville. And we're excited to hear your perspective as an elected official, Dave.
Well, good morning. I appreciate all I've heard so far from JD and Liz about their efforts in this movement to make our cities and state smoke-free. It's an endeavor that's certainly worth pursuing for all of the obvious reasons. Campbellsville is, of course, in Taylor County, and we are a strong agrarian community with a lot of tobacco interest in the community. And when this first was raised as an issue it did not seem likely that we would be able to pass a smoke-free ordinance. We have a fairly large council composed of 12 individuals, elected individuals. And at the time this came up, one of the city council members was a smoker, smoked a lot. Very nice fella, good guy, but very much opposed, of course, to any kind of smoke-free policy or initiative. And it was pretty difficult to raise it. I wanted to be deferential to him. I wanted to raise the issue, but he became ill, eventually passed away from lung cancer, and it just did not seem appropriate when it first came up to fight that battle with him, dealing with his own health problems as a pretty much direct result, I guess, of his lifelong smoking habit. So we didn't move forward for a time. He passed away, and the landscape changed a little bit in terms of the support. And at some point after that, we had a meeting with downtown merchants. We've got a fairly active downtown business association in our community, and we had an informal meeting downtown with a number of the merchants and interested people to talk about the future of becoming the possible future of becoming a non-smoke community, and found that there was a good bit of support among the business community for moving forward with that kind of an initiative. So eventually we did. Of course, we got a city government, we've got the county government. We've not merged our governments, and in the county it's a much harder sell, and they have still not taken up the fight for smoke-free. But on the other hand, virtually all of the restaurants and public businesses are located in the city, so it's really a city issue. And so we raised the issue initially. I think our ordinance was first adopted in June 2009, but it came up earlier than that and was discussed on several occasions, and there was a mixed positions as to whether or not this should happen. On the one hand, there was the support for non-smoking was centered around restaurants, really, and most restaurants were in favor of their establishments being smoke-free, but the usual position was we don't want to do this unless everybody's doing it, because they felt like, you know, it might hurt business. Actually, I argued that probably the opposite would be true, and I think eventually the restaurant owners came around to that position. But there was a lot of discussion about it in our community. In 2009, I think June the 1st, 2009, it was actually enacted as an ordinance in our city. It was not until 2019 that we amended the ordinance to ban e-cigarettes in our community. That was a little bit more of a contentious fight, because we had a businessman who had an e-cig business here, and we don't want to hurt any of our businesses in the community, and it was a little bit hard to gather support to ban something that would put the guy out of business. But eventually that happened, and in 2019 we also banned e-cigs in the community. There's really been no adverse reactions. Everything has been positive. It's just kind of hard now to imagine going into a restaurant. I think we only have one bar in the community, but it's kind of hard to imagine going into any of these establishments and having to deal with smoke. And I think our community just takes that now for granted. And I have to say, it's been a good thing. And I've really, if there's been any negative feedback, it has not come to my attention. So I think it's generally been a good thing in our community. I made a note here, a couple of things. It did take several years to gain broad support. It was a concerted effort over a long period of time, but eventually, I think most people, even though we're in a smoking community or smoking county, most people really value being in a restaurant where they don't have to deal with secondhand smoke. And so as time went on, the support grew for making that a reality, particularly as other communities around the state were doing that, and it became a more accepted thing to do. I mentioned earlier that we did have a meeting at one point that was attended by most, I think, a very large crowd of folks from our downtown business community, and they were very much in support, and that was very influential, of course, in our community. We are a one city county, and the combined opinion of our downtown merchants was, I think, very influential. And then the other thing that really got us over the top was just the popularity, really, of being able to go and have a nice meal in a place where you didn't have to smell other people's smoke. And so when it finally came to a vote by the city council, I don't remember what the vote was. I do not think it was unanimous, but there was very strong support. We've really, in the about 30 years I've been on the city council, we've always had a city council that has mostly, I think, been progressive in the sense that it's always looking to do the right thing and to do what's beneficial for the community, and not necessarily bound by old traditions and old thinking and that sort of thing. And so when it finally did come up for a vote, I haven't looked this up, but as memory serves, it was unanimous or a near unanimous vote of our 12-person city council to adopt it. And it's, I can just sort of end things by saying it's been a wonderful thing for our community and for the businesses in our community. And number one, it's worth the fight for any community. Number two, I think those of you who are in cities and counties where you think it just couldn't happen, I sort of thought that too at the beginning, but it was once the thinking became generally accepted, it wasn't that hard to do. And as I say, we had a unanimous vote at the city council to ban smoking. And once it was banned in the city, that just pretty much took care of the whole county. So I'd like to encourage all of you that live in the smaller rural counties to fight the good fight and keep it up and be positive about the potential for success. It'll probably happen if you work at it. Thanks very much for having me participate in this today. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. So we are just going to jump straight into questions in a minute. If anybody wants to come back on the screen, thanks, Liz. Before I do that, I do just want to give one reminder that we are going to go ahead and drop that evaluation link in the chat. And if you fill that out and let us know your thoughts on the presentations you've heard today, you can be entered to win a gift card. So there we go. So we'll go into the question and answer session, like I said, and we have one really good one already. So I'll just jump straight in with a question from Amanda, who wanted to know, I think for Liz and Dave in particular, can you talk more about how you were able to identify your internal champions? What level of support for a smoke-free policy did they have at the start? And how did you enhance that relationship over time? So Liz, you could talk about what worked for you, and Dave, you could talk about what made you feel comfortable supporting this.
We identified our initial 3 champions in 2006 through conversations with them. We had built kind of that relationship when we were sending out information just in general about what the Tobacco Coalition was doing. And then we started to ask some questions from the tobacco assessment, the policymaker assessment. And we identified that they would be supportive of a policy. And we just had conversations with them and kind of grew their support by sharing more data that we had. And they were just very willing supporters. They kind of identified themselves, I guess, as supporters of the policy. Connected with them throughout the process, and we thanked them and showed appreciation, and we made sure their constituents also showed appreciation. The second time around, it was kind of ironic because one of the initial magistrates who voted against the first ordinance actually ended up being one of the magistrates on the committee that revamped the ordinance in 2017. So he was not a champion initially, but he became a champion over the years, I think, when he saw the implementation and he learned more about the impact that it had on the community.
Thank you. Dave?
I anticipated a lot of opposition and thought it would be a hard sell in our community, but it really wasn't when it came down to it. And I think if other communities are anything like ours, you might underestimate the support that your community has for a non-smoking environment in public places. It was, I think, a very welcome thing here when it happened. We didn't have a lot of opposition once the ball started rolling. And I mentioned that there was one city council member who was a chain smoker and very nice fella, and a lot of deference was given to him initially, just being polite to our neighbor. But that sort of melted away, and from there on, it was pretty smooth sailing to adopt it in our community. I'm not sure that that's representative of all the 120 counties in the state, but a lot of them have. And by the way, do we know how many of our counties are smoke-free now, JD? Do you have that information?
I think Ellen shared a graphic at the start to show 55 communities.
55 communities, and I'm not sure how many are counties, though. And Amanda might have that answer and be able to put that in the chat for us.
Yeah. Well,
Go ahead, Dave. I didn't want to interrupt you.
No, that's okay. That's a really an encouraging number, and I'd be interested to know what percentage of our population that represents. I suspect that it's a pretty substantial portion. I would think that the more populous cities and counties are the ones that have been on the bandwagon first, really. But that's a very encouraging thing for a traditional tobacco state. And I don't know how that compares to other states, but I would think that we're setting a very good example nationwide.
I'll just add too, just on the subject, if you don't have a champion now sitting in a legislative body, Kentucky cities average every 2 years a 38% turnover. So every 2 years, it's constantly city government. The governance structure is constantly changing. So even if you don't have one now, you can probably, just elected in the 2020 election. We have brand new council members and commissioners and mayors occupying the seats. So the policy discussion will always be fresh.
And I would bet that if some ambitious citizen in the community was interested in serving on the city council or the fiscal court and they campaigned hard on that issue, that they would probably gain a lot of votes for their effort.
I think that's a great idea. We're running a little bit short on time, but I do have one question, another question that's been submitted by Casey that you all kind of, I think, have touched on, and that is, do you have any recommendations for gaining support from public officials who use tobacco? In Kentucky, this could potentially be a big issue for your community. So how do you get those votes or be persuasive?
I'm not sure that I've got an answer for that. But you know, the reality is that you know, I've been around a long time. I'm 73 years old, and I remember the day when everybody smoked, and it was a very common thing in public places and every place. That's not true today, and smoking just does not seem to have the popularity among most people today that it once had. And so I think if you've got a community where most people are in favor of smoking, you'd be very unusual. And I just think most communities, most citizens would love to see non-smoking environments in their community. I don't have any data to support that, but.
And I'll add briefly, we did have some community advocates who were current smokers who came and spoke at fiscal court in support of the ordinance because they wanted to be able to take their families to non-smoking establishments. So I don't know what internally had them supportive. We tried really hard to make sure with our magistrates that we were listening to their concerns. So we did have one who said that if you opened up the dictionary to look at former smoker, it would be him in the pictures. We just tried to listen to their concerns and address them as we could with the data that we had. But I think one thing is those relationships are really important, and being able to listen and not just talk is important.
JD, do you have any thoughts or other parting comments?
I don't know how you get that. I recall coming out of law school and writing that brief, and my grandmother was a smoker, and of course she said, "Well, we sent you to law school here, and the first thing you're going to do is take away my right to smoke." But the discussion with her, you know, about the impacts and the data that Lexington had gathered, you know, I was able to talk through that with her about how her doing that in public could impact. A lot of those are personal discussions, as Liz pointed out. I think listening, hearing the concerns of the people who are ultimately going to vote on it, as Dave talked about. You know, for a while they kind of danced around there in Campbellsville. One of the individuals who had strongly held beliefs about it. But I think 20 years later, or almost 20 years later now, I think there's a whole different perspective on that, and I think Liz's counsel is extremely wise. Yeah,
well, that's been great advice from all three of you. I really appreciate it. I'll also say my personal experience. I'm part of a smoke-free coalition in my hometown that has not passed a policy yet, but we have that conversation about, I'm not trying to take away your right to smoke. I'm not anti-tobacco. I have family members who farm, but this is about protecting other, non-smokers' rights and workers' rights. So,
could I mention one quick thing in closing? The 2006 Surgeon General's report is full of information. It still is a real good Bible on the benefits of non-smoking, and it was very, very helpful to me when I was trying to prepare for the non-smoking fight in our community.
And I'll add to that too. There are so many people on this call that have so much more knowledge than I do. that have worked in different communities that have passed it in different ways. And I would encourage you to reach out to them because they can help you even sometimes mentally get through, but then to know how to address certain issues as they come up. There's a lot of knowledge in this state on policy change.
And that is such a great segue. Thank you all so much for all of your time and what you've shared with us. I have two last plugs. One is that the Kentucky Center for Smoke-Free Policy does have an annual awards ceremony. That will be on August 3rd virtually via Zoom. You'll see the link to register for that on the screen and in the chat. And I just have to point out that all three of today's presenters are recipients of Smoke-Free Awards. So JD and Dave have both received the Legal Counsel Smoke-Free Support Award, JD for that amicus brief with the Supreme Court that you mentioned, and Liz in 2019 received the Smoke-Free Hero Award. So that just shows you the caliber of people and the expertise that we will be highlighting at that ceremony. So we hope many of you all will join us as we celebrate. I'll give one more shout out to our amazing sponsors who make presentations like this possible. Those were UK Healthcare, Kentucky Health Collaborative, the Kentucky Asthma Management Program, and Interact for Health. Thank you so much. And as Liz just said, there is amazing support out there. I think all three of our presenters talked about the Kentucky Center for Smoke-Free Policy, who is one of the hosts of this webinar. They can help you with community readiness assessments, the air quality monitoring that Liz mentioned, model policies, there was one of those dropped in the chat, media resources, county level data, fact sheets. So if you are at all interested in passing or in strengthening a smoke-free ordinance, we definitely encourage you to reach out to them. Their email address is on the screen. I actually have a poll that I'm going to launch for anybody who's still on the line. We're just curious to know if you already have a policy, if you're trying to get one, if you're trying to get a stronger one, or maybe you're not sure. You actually find a lot. There are so many communities where there are kind of voluntary policies and they're not aware that a law hasn't been passed yet. So it looks like we have about 50-50 between not yet and yes. So that is great. I hope you all learned a lot today. I can't thank you enough for spending your Tuesday morning with us, especially if this was your first time presenting in a Kentucky Tobacco Control Conference webinar. Again, please take advantage of those resources from the Kentucky Center for Smoke-Free Policy and enjoy the rest of your week.